Hello there again. Are you ready for more Sega arcades? I know I am. This is going to be quite an interesting one. Today we've put together a video covering the games from 4 different arcade boards. There's the System 18, System 24, System 32 and System C. Put together, these 4 represent the last of the Sega system line. After this, the model boards would come in and they'd be all nice and 3D and all that good stuff. After we're done with this video, however, we're going to be taking on a video that's totally devoted to the superscalar, vector and discrete logic hardware. In other words, probably the most famous of all Sega's arcade games. For the most part, these boards don't represent Sega's most famous titles. In fact, these boards come together for a very curious selection. There's a lot of gems here that you may not have heard of at all, plenty of games that never left Japan, plenty of games that never left the arcade. So if you're looking for some unknown games to fire up in MAME or what have you, you may well want to tune in. But before we get into the big list of games from worst to best, let's actually look at the hardware itself, so we know what we're dealing with. There's not a massive amount to say about the System 18 board. As the name suggests, it's like a souped up version of the classic System 16 board. The main difference, and indeed reason for its existence, is that Sega rejigged the design of the board to make it more compatible with the Jammer standard, which was becoming ever more prevalent around the time of this board's introduction in 1989. You could in a way class these games then as the last System 16 titles, although there were other notable upgrades in the sound and graphics departments. There's not too many System 18 titles. It lasted from 1989 to 1992, and only 9 games were made on the board. The System 32 is the true successor to the System 16 board. In fact, it's also the successor to Sega's X and Y scalar boards, an attempt to finally merge everything together into one board that was capable of Sega's signature sprite scaling, as well as great 2D and all of that. You'll find that because of this, a lot of System 32 games end up being pseudo 3D. You'll have levels that will certainly look 3D, but it's all done using sprite work and lots of scaling. As the name suggests, this is Sega's first 32-bit arcade system, first appearing in 1990 and not retiring until 1995. It was still used often well after Sega released the Model 1. They kind of complement each other, seeing as the Model 1 could do proper 3D, but it couldn't handle any texture mapping. Also of note, we've got the System Multi-32 variation. This had a new processor and a dual monitor display, designed for twin cabinets. System 32 games are mostly arcade exclusive. They were far too overpowered for faithful Mega Drive ports, and by the time the Saturn came along, they were mostly too old-fashioned. In fact, of the 21 games released for the board, only 3 got any kind of home port whatsoever. The System 24 lands somewhat outside the regular system line, designed for a different sort of arcade game. This board was built specifically to handle high-resolution 2D arcade games, whereas what we've seen so far largely stuck to the more traditional 320x224 resolution. The System 24 has a 496x384 display and 98,304 colours, with a max of 16,384 on screen at any one time. The games that take advantage of that are certainly way more colourful and sharp than the norm as a result. Annoyingly, a good half of the 14 System 24 games are Japanese-only quiz and mahjong games that are barely worth listing here, but most of the arcade games that use System 24 are absolute belters. And finally, we have the System C board. This is, well, it's primarily a Mega Drive. The System C uses the exact same CPU, sound and graphics processor as the Mega Drive, meaning that a lot of the games you'll find here that were ported to the MD are just about identical to their home versions. There are a couple of differences. The 68000 is clocked faster in the System C, working at 9 MHz and handling the sound directly with no Z80. The faster speed allows sound to be handled without any slowdown in the game. System C games aren't necessarily lookers, as you might expect, but you'll find them mostly used for some pretty cracking puzzle games and the like. The board also had a fairly long life, extended further by Atlas, who used it, with Sega, for the very popular Print Club series of arcade cabinets. These little blighters allowed you to take a pic of your face and have it printed complete with a load of stickers, and they were a big hit indeed. Now obviously these aren't listed here because for some utterly inexplicable reason, MAME doesn't have such printing and camera features integrated into its program. Lazy buggers. While we're here and talking about Mega Drive adjacent hardware, we may as well have a little word on Megatech and Megaplay. These arcade systems were, again, primarily Mega Drives. The Megatech allowed the user to stick 8 cartridges into it, which can then be selected from a menu and played with time restrictions, much like Nintendo's Play Choice 10. Megatech and Megaplay cartridges were built specifically for the board. You can't simply shove a retail Mega Drive game into the board, and a Megatech specific cartridge isn't compatible with most Mega Drives. However, a cheeky little adapter was made for the Megatech that would allow you to use retail games. This was done by, of all people, Teartex. The main difference between Megatech and Megaplay is that only 4 cartridges were allowed with the latter, but rather than using time restrictions, Megaplay games used regular old life systems instead. However, the versions of the games were rejigged somewhat so that play would be shorter. Naturally, we're not including any of these games in the list because, well, they're Mega Drive games. Righto, that's a bunch of good old-fashioned technical info for ya. As we count down the list, I'll be sure to inform you of the board that each game's using too, so that you can recognise the differences further. And with that, well, we have a list to get on with. We are counting down 52 games from the very worst to the very best, so there's no more time to waste. Let's get moving, man! Our bottom game is this really bloody awful golf title right here. This is a pseudo 3D affair that tries to play like the popular games made by T&D Soft like Pebble Beach Golf Links and what have you, but gets it completely and utterly wrong. It also does a pseudo 3D type thing where the background has to constantly redraw itself just about every time you move the shot. It's completely awful and borderline unplayable. Golf isn't necessarily a no-go in the arcades, but this is a miserable experience. I can't help but think that if this was made for the System 32 board, it would be a lot more playable. However, this is a System 24 game, I don't think that's suited for this board in the slightest, and the result is a hideously botched way to spoil a good walk. Sega and beat-em-ups usually are a no-brainer, most of the time. However, we have seen the odd stinker kicking around their more obscure cabinets in the past, and DD Crew right here? This is undoubtedly the worst. A truly hideous effort. The only thing that really makes the game stand out at all is that the graphics and characters aim for a touch more in the way of realism compared to most other fighters. But other than that, well, the player characters have almost no moves, there's about 5 different enemies in the entire game, the music is an absolutely catastrophic attempt at aping 90s hip-hop, and it eats up coins like a hoover. I think it's safe to say that this is the worst beat-em-up ever produced by a frontline Sega team, a complete loser in every way. This game is famous mainly for being the answer to a couple of trivia questions. Not only is Radmobile Sega's first 32-bit game, it's also the first appearance of a certain spiky blue hedgehog. Sonic swings about from the rearview mirror 5 months before the release of the original Mega Drive game. Aside from these facts, there's barely anything to the actual racing game. The graphics aren't impressive anymore, the controls are really sensitive, and the gameplay is non-existent. Time has most certainly not been kind to Radmobile, I'm afraid to say. Even back in the day, most people felt that this game didn't have much going for it aside from graphics, and nowadays, well, it doesn't have that. Not good. And while we would never see a port of Revenge of Death Adder, we would inexplicably see this get a home port in 1994, when it was released for the Saturn under the name Gale Racer in Japan only. It's kind of tricky to give Holosseum a placing on the list. This is a very simple fighting game by 1992 standards, but it relied on its unique cabinet. As the name suggests, this game was played in a special holographic cabinet that gives the look of the game a very unique appearance. It's kind of cool to see. But of course, when you're just playing it in MAME, all you're actually going to get is some basic sprites on a black screen. The illusion is broken. The fighting itself is very old school, karate champ-esque even, and there's not much to say. Obviously not fun, but a game that's very much tied up with its cabinet, so don't really take number 49 as gospel, I guess. Our next 3 games all go into one entry because they're all quite similar. They aren't so much games as they are wides for little kids, similar to the Ultraman game from the System 16 video. They only came out in Japan, they're very short, they provide a little bit of rudimentary gameplay, a bit of top-down shooting or racing in most cases, it's impossible to die or even to lose the game, and it all ends with a little bit of a waiting and a thank you or bye bye. Cute. Of obvious interest here at least are 2 obscure Sonic appearances, Waku Waku Sonic Patrol Car and Sega Sonic Cosmo Fighter Galaxy Patrol. 2 little vignettes where the Blue Bullet deals with Dr. Eggman in the usual manner. Rad Rally is the sequel to Radmobile, and it doesn't change an awful lot. Obviously this time you've got the more traditional trappings of a rally game as opposed to the racing against cops dealio in Radmobile, but this is still very much something that relies entirely on graphics. It's a bit more controllable in Radmobile, but the racing is very awkward and feels so digital, which doesn't exactly work out well when you're inside the cockpit. And again, the technical side of the game has hardly held up to time. This wasn't any match for most of Sega's other racing titles at the time, let alone now. Okay, so this is generally a high quality list. We're only at number 44, but a lot of the titles we're going to see from now on are almost certainly interesting and games that you might want to check out. And we are also going to be seeing a lot of competitive puzzle type games. That's a definite theme, and you'll find most of them on the souped up Mega Drive System C board. Twin Squash here is basically a competitive form of Arkanoid. Quite a neat concept, although one that's really bloody hard. It's rather unique, but it does feel a bit more like you're desperately trying to survive the constantly descending blocks, as opposed to actually having a competitive match with the other player. Your mileage may vary on this one, particularly if you really do enjoy Arkanoid and other breakout derivatives. One of 2 fairly ordinary but not all that bad top-down racers we're going to be seeing in the lower reaches of the list. Hot Rod is a perfectly typical example of such a game. You've got a bunch of cars, you can upgrade between races as long as you don't come last, there's a few different terrains to play with. It is what it is, basically. Good, but not as good as Supercars 2 on the Amiga. Here's something a bit different, a Dragon Ball Z game. Now, as is often the case with these, it's a one-on-one fighter, although quite a different one. Here you're playing from a first-person perspective, jumping about and charging up various wild attacks. There's not an awful lot to the game, you can't exactly move around too much, and it's mainly just holding down buttons, getting those big charge-ups and wars in and trying to hit the opponent. You can dodge and block and you can go close in for some rapid combos, but it is more spectacle than game in many ways. However, that is not necessarily a negative in an arcade setting, of course. This would fit right into any game centre you can think of, so it's not bad. And here's the other fairly ordinary but not all that bad top-down racer. Rough Racer has a single screen layout, a fair bit like the Atari Super Sprint games. I like this sort of presentation a lot more, which is why this got the nod over Hot Rod, even if it's not exactly original and, indeed, perhaps a bit more derivative. As in most games like this, you're racing and pacing and hogging the turns, you're looking for someone whose fire still burns, and you've got some nitrous oxide to play with too. It's all good so long as you don't crash and end up last. Perfectly acceptable. Well, this one to start the top 40 is a weird one. Wally no Sagase is a Where's Wally based game, or Where's Waldo if you're American. Most attempts to turn the elusive man of the bestriped jumper into a video game have been complete disasters, of course. This is somewhat better by virtue of adding a strict time limit, a whole lot of bells and whistles, and some completely strange sections like this one where you have to tickle a bearded man's foot. It's all in Japanese, so I'm not sure what exactly is going on here, but I doubt it's any less strange when placed in context. However, all of these things means that I can absolutely say that this is by far the best Where's Wally based game in the entire history of video games. And with that, I do believe I found a new top example of damning something with faint praise. Here's Air Rescue, streaking in at number 39 and looking quite fancy, for 1992 anyways. This isn't bad. It's basically a first-person choplifter where, once again, you have to go behind enemy lines, rescue hostages, and bring them back to base. This is a bit more forgiving, mind you, in that your ship can take a little bit of a beating. It is tricky to get used to, and it's not exactly a technical showcase anymore, but it's not bad. This is the first twin cabinet system multi-32 game on the list, by the way. Two players can play simultaneously, but they've both got their own cab to play with. Annoyingly, this means that when you play it in MAME, by default the game looks like this. Not a big deal, and I presume there's some setting or other that could be changed, but yeah, we've got a few of these games here. Also of note is that Air Rescue was one of the few System 32 games to get a home port. Sort of. Of all things, it was for the Master System, and obviously it wasn't too faithful. True to the game's origins, it's a perfectly okay side-scrolling game that plays much like a follow-up to Choplifter. And in fact, here's another multi-system game right away. F1 Exhaust Note is one of 3 Formula 1 racing games we're going to be seeing here. 2 of them, the ones by Sega, are pretty average. Better than Radmobile at least, but still not brilliant racers. Most of Sega's races in this time are in a bit of an awkward spot, just after most of the legendary Scalar games, just before hitting the front again with Virtua Racing. Not exactly bad games, they've just been almost completely forgotten. Okie dokie, we have a weird and very interesting one. This is Ribbit. If I was to clickbait this one, I would call it the completely unknown Frogger sequel that you never knew existed. This game is a lot like Frogger, as you can surely see. You control your frogs in a very much Frogger grid style, usually jumping on logs and animals and other things, only now the goal is to eat flies dotted around the level. It is perfectly okay, not exactly as charming as the original. And in the end, it was perhaps too close to Frogger. Konami threatened Sega with legal action over the game, meaning its arcade life was incredibly short and the game is ultra rare. Unless you have access to the huge Galloping Ghost arcade in Illinois, you'll be very lucky to find this anywhere outside of MAME. It's been far too long since we've seen a classically mediocre top-down shooter, and Scramble Spirits happily fits the bill. This is the sort of arcade game that fits into a weird category of, really? That was originally an arcade? Huh. I noticed when I did the original System 16 video that a lot of people said that about Action Fighter. Much like that game, I certainly identify Scramble Spirits as a Master System game and not an arcade. Indeed, it's much better on the Master System too. It's not necessarily a brilliant shooter there, but the arcade version, aside from the nice high-resolution graphics, is not exactly a massive upgrade. the second Sega F1 game. F1 Superlap is the sequel to Exhaust Note, and it makes a few minor improvements. Having an FIA license is obviously quite nice, even if it doesn't do all that much to affect gameplay. The biggest tweak is an overtake button, which acts as a little turbo boost, sort of like DRS, I guess. All of this makes for a marginally better game than Exhaust Note, so it's a couple of places further up. I think it's clear that I'm struggling for much to say with this one, innit? Licensed game time, and it's alien free. Rather well treated for a not particularly great film, isn't it? Of course, we have the all-time classic Mega Drive game, and we also have the not quite as good but still really cool SNES game, and then there's this arcade, which is a little bit more mediocre. Alien Free The Gun isn't bad or anything as far as shoot everything that moves type games go, it's just that it's hard for games to stand out here, in all honesty. The Gun does end up feeling a bit like Line of Fire, only with an alien skin. Also, there is a much more memorable rail shooter based on the licensed property to come, so this one's kinda getting a bad beat. Wireframe boxing arcade games had a fairly long shelf life as it happens. Years after Punch-Out, and also years after Sega's own Punch-Out rip-off, Heavyweight Champ, we have a better sequel, Title Fight. Now, as you can clearly see, this game sadly isn't emulated all that brilliantly in MAME. Obviously, it doesn't look like this at all in original form. There's supposed to be an audience, an arena, a Madison Square Garden type thing and all that, not this gradient. But the gameplay itself is as you would expect. It's a happy little button basher. Not exactly filled with deep boxing strategy or anything like that, but then this is an arcade game, not a simulation, so it's fine. Here's another one for the "wait, this was an arcade game" category. Super Masters is the arcade version of a game that eventually saw release on the Mega Drive as either Jumbo Ozaki no Super Masters or Arnold Palmer Tournament Golf, depending on where you are. It's even got by far the best thing about that game, which is the really bouncy and cheerful background music that accompanies the play. No Fantasy Zone Easter eggs, sadly. Anywho, it's a golf game. It's certainly better than that awful first one we saw, but it's not exactly Neo Turf Masters quality. People were very amused during the last list all about Sega's early years to see just how many complete rip-off titles Sega authored back then, and even if they were firmly amongst the top arcade studios by now, in the late 80s, early 90s, you still get the odd bout of blatant unoriginality. I can sum Desert Breaker up in literally one word. It's Mercs. Desert Breaker is so close to Capcom's original top-down game that it really surprises me to find no details on Capcom threatening Sega with legal action. I mean, Capcom tried to sue Data East over Fighter's history, and this is an even bigger rip-off. All that said, Mercs is a pretty good game, and Desert Breaker is a pretty good game too. It obviously loses points for unoriginality, but it's still quite a fun and exciting one and gunner. It does feel appropriate to put Burning Rival next to Desert Breaker, although this game is more important historically. How so? It's the first fighting game by the Sega AM2 division, although it's minus Yu Suzuki. Their next one after Burning Rival would be a rather obscure title by the name of Virtua Fighter. Burning Rival is the toe dipped into the water, I guess. This is a competent game indeed, but as with many fighters of the time, it is trying to ride on Street Fighter 2's coattails. The best thing about it, though, is Zero One's really smooth animation. Even though the characters are kind of generic in the game, the animation is damn good. It's just a shame that's the only really notable thing about it. Okay, here's something controversial. I do like quite a lot of competitive puzzle games. A lot of the ones I like are quite similar to Puyo Puyo. There's even other games that are pretty much in the Puyo Puyo universe that I really do enjoy, but I'm not massively big on the original Puyo Puyo, and never have been. Whether it's here in the arcade or on the Mega Drive, or even if it's got a Sonic related reskin. I just get annoyed by this one, and I'm not overly sure why. I always find it difficult to actually match the blocks because they're not differentiated enough for a start. I mean, to be fair, that doesn't help that I'm a little colourblind when it comes to blue and purple. I'm just no good at it at all, as you can plainly see. Still, this doesn't extend to a dislike of the whole franchise. Compile's game is hugely influential, worthy of all the praise it gets. I just don't enjoy it. One of those, know what I mean, eh, Faulty?
You got me! Oh no! Oh no!
Sega and sports don't always go hand in hand, aside from obvious things like their racing games and a whole load of baseball titles back in the System 16 days. This is the third arcade board countdown we've done for Sega, and shockingly, Super Visual Football is the first footy game that we've seen. Just wasn't their thing, I guess. Mind you, they would get pretty good at it. Super Visual Football is, like a lot of System 32 titles, a sort of mix between 2D and 3D. Different and cool perspective, flat sprites. Surprisingly easy for an arcade game too. Either that or I'm just too strong when it comes to arcade football games. It's fun, but eclipsed in Sega's library as soon as Virtua Striker came out. This really is the list of puzzle games, and Blockseed finally gives us a Tetris variation, Sega's second big one after Flashpoint. Blockseed's take on the classic is based around different power blocks that will either help or hinder you in your quest to form tetrominos into lines, depending on what you're doing. You can clear a whole bunch of blocks at once, you can add blocks in one at a time with the help of Flicky, chuck a 16-ton weight in there, amongst other things. You need to do it fast, as incomplete lines will start appearing in the well if you dawdle. I prefer Flashpoint to this one, I have to say, but it is quite a neat variation, coming out a while before the main Tetris franchise itself really started dipping into power-ups. Stack Columns is the first of a couple of Columns games. You didn't think that wasn't going to make an appearance here, did you? These boards are the home of Sega's Columns titles, and Stack Columns here can simply be summed up as competitive columns. In the main, it just plays like regular columns, only with the addition of the stack, which first appeared in Columns 3. You build that up, and then you unleash the wall from below onto your opponent. Also of note is a weird plot where you avenge your father's death, and Sega's quite amusing commentary on gaming history. I found myself facing up against a genius Russian monkey by the name of Pajitnov, trained by the science department to do their bidding for presumably little more except bananas. Kinda like the man himself and his lack of compensation for making Tetris, isn't it? Number 25, right about the halfway point of the list, is a fitting spot for a game that many find to be a very curious one. Sega Sonic the Hedgehog. This was the Blue Bullet's first major arcade outing, after all, and yet it's quite an obscure game that was never released outside of Japan. A big part of this was because Sega's main aim for this game was purely to have a really successful Sonic title in their home country, where they were still primarily seen as an arcade studio. It wasn't even their first attempt. There was a competitive puzzle game called Sonic Brothers, created by no less a figure than the creator of Bubble Bobble, Fukio Mitsuji. This game, however, didn't pass Sega's location testing, and thus it ended up unreleased, hence why it's not ranked here. Sega Sonic the Hedgehog would be the one that finally gave the spiky blue hedgehog a proper presence in their game centres. The weirdness doesn't really stop there. This and other games are called Sega Sonic because, for a very short time, Sega actually lost their trademark rights to Sonic, apparently because Sega of America didn't file paperwork in time. The handful of Sega Sonic titles that came out in 1993 are a result of that. And then the game itself is also weird. An isometric game that's controlled with a trackball, it plays a lot like an obstacle course with jumps to make and traps to dodge, and not an awful lot in the way of enemies. It's quite short, pretty slight as a game, and very hard to play in MAME due to the very twitchy controls. The story of the game is a hell of a lot more interesting than playing it, that's for sure. But it's a very curious part of the history of Sega's main mascot. Here's a beat 'em up by Sega that never left the arcades. And no, it's not the one everyone thinks of as soon as that's mentioned. This is Arabian Fight, a jolly snazzy game for 1991 that puts you in the shoes of 4 warriors who must rescue a princess that's fallen in the hands of a corrupt sheik in very generic fashion. The game comes with quite a lot of bells and whistles. It's a System 32 game and the visual effects are quite something, with enemies jumping into the action from the foreground, or indeed being thrown out of it Turtles in Time style, and some really awesome magic effects. It is not all the way impressive. The animation is pretty damn lousy, almost to the level of a digitised game like Pit Fighter. But on the gameplay front, the game ain't half bad. It's certainly a hell of a lot better than DD Crew. You may well still Google your eyes a bit at some of this game's ultra cool tricks. I said at the start that this list would be quite weird. We've got strange puzzle games, strange licensed titles, strange games involving Sega's main mascot, all sorts. A lot of this is because many of the games in this list never left Japan, so a lot of them are obscure as a result. But a lot of them are certainly worth plucking out of that obscurity. And games rarely get more Japanese than Zunzunkyu no Yabo, an arena shooter of sorts where you play as a statue and take on various different enemies, all incredibly steeped in Japanese culture. Hints of Buddhism, tons of salarymen, strange game shows, it's all here. I suppose it's not surprising that this game never got localised. I mean, just look at it. But that didn't stop I'm Sorry from getting a Western release, so hey, you never know. It's almost a shame that this game didn't, as it's actually a lot of fun as well as being totally strange. A very playable arcade game indeed that I would definitely recommend to people. Now, just because a game's based on a major licence, hell, one of the biggest you could get in this time period, doesn't mean that the end result isn't going to be quite odd. Case in point, Sega's Jurassic Park arcade game. This is quite different from the game we'd see on the Mega Drive. Much like Alien 3, we've got a rail shooter. And Jurassic Park is one of the most ridiculous examples of the genre. A frenzied ride where you're stuck on the back of a jeep, literally millions of dinosaurs are thrown at you, you even somehow end up in the middle of the dinosaurs' extinction at one point, there's thousands of smiling raptors, and the whole thing is accompanied by perhaps the weirdest soundtrack in the history of arcade games. It sounds like every instrument being thrown down a spiral staircase at once. Seriously, it's more out there than Streets of Rage 3. Is it a good game? That's debatable, but it's certainly quite the memorable one. If you know your Mega Drive games well, you may be aware of a quite cool early puzzle game on the system called Junction. You get a grid, you've got a marble, and you need to construct its path. A neat take on Pipe Dream, basically. Borench here is quite similar to that, only this time you've got far bigger levels. You get plenty of bonus points for constructing loops and touching bonus stars and so on, but you don't necessarily get masses of time to do such things, as the ball starts moving fast pretty sharpish. It kinda has Junction's odd little vibe too, which is nice to see. I always like it when a puzzle game doesn't have a generic or cutesy appearance. Another one that I would recommend to puzzle boards, and unlike a lot of the puzzlers here, it's not even competitive. The top 20 begins with Spider-Man. I seem to play this game quite a lot for whatever reason, even if it's not especially brilliant. It is a Spider-Man game, mind you. You can play as Spider-Man, obviously, as well as other characters who aren't Spider-Man. Okay, let's give them a fair shout. There's Hawkeye, Black Cat, and Namor, and they're all fine. They get to fight the typical Spider-Man rogues gallery in what's a mixture of beat-em-up action and platforming. You get different sections of the stage where the level will zoom out, and you'll get to do some more traditional single-plane shenanigans. Is it a jack-of-all-trades and a master of none? Kind of. Spider-Man's a pretty high-quality IP as far as licensed games go, with some exceptions. And this is about in the middle of Spider-Man games. It's perfectly fine. As mentioned previously, I am not big on the original Puyo Puyo. However, there's plenty of other games in the series and loads of variations, most of which I prefer. Puyo Puyo 2 is a thoroughly nice sequel, mainly because, well, it's just easier to bloody play in all honesty. It's a lot easier to differentiate colours this time around, hey! Slight blue and purple colour blindness issues aside, this doesn't change too much compared to the original. It's a perfectly good competitive puzzle game that would inspire an awful amount of really creative variations that would often better Compile's first efforts. It's another multi-system 32 game. Annoying to play in MAME? Perhaps, but Hard Dunk is actually a lot of fun. We've got more pseudo 3D action, just like the football game we saw a few entries ago, but instead we've got street basketball played with just the one hoop. Doing such a thing is quite smart actually. This would probably be far more bloody annoying if there was all sorts of revolving crap like some rubbish SNES Mode 7 sports game, but instead it's a nice basketball game that plays very quickly. Of course, for most people there is no point to playing any arcade basketball game that isn't NBA Jam, and I can certainly respect that as it is one of the greatest arcades ever, but Hard Dunk definitely has its own merits. Sticking with pseudo 3D, here's Stadium Cross. We're going back to racing games. This is a bit different actually, as it's motocross. Not something I'd have necessarily expected to see, but here we go. Actually, there is another Sega motocross game that we'll see in the next video. You've got your typical motocross stadium course with lots of jumps that you should try and take properly, but amusingly in a touch no doubt inspired by Road Rash, you can also punch your fellow riders in the face. I'm sure that doing this would be completely illegal in an actual motocross race, and it doesn't actually seem to affect the action all that much, but you can still do it as much as you want, which is cool. I quite like this as a racer, as it goes. It's a lot better than the others we've already seen, even if Sega was still hardly operating at final form when it comes to racing games.
Number 1 takes off. Number 5 is in the lead. 1 to go. Who's going to the championship this season? Number 5 is in the lead. 1 to go.
We are once again sending our love down the well, and this time we're sending it along with a bunch of hexagons. This is one of those really cool Puyo Puyo variations. You build from the top and you've got hexagons that interlock in various ways. 4 or more hexagons of the same colour will disappear, and obviously the idea is to get as big a line of the same coloured hexagons as possible. As with a lot of the games, the tricky part is that you're going to have multiple big colour blocks going at the same time, and you're trying very hard not to ruin them. It's very risk-rewardy. How big do you want to go, and just when do you make the move? Hopefully you make it before the opponent does. It's such a cool little balancing act, and this game is also appropriately head-spinny. I really enjoy it, and definitely recommend it. We're into the top 15 now, and we've got another case of a poor game that got eclipsed rather by a different home version with the same name. In the System 16 video we had poor old Cyber Police eSWAT, and now we have Shadow Dancer. This one's almost a double dipper in fact, in that either people greatly prefer the Mega Drive Shadow Dancer, or they consider Revenge of Shinobi to be the proper sequel to Shinobi and not, you know, this. Shadow Dancer is closer to the arcade original in that you die in one hit, and you've got a number of bombs to defuse in each level, functioning the same as the little ninja kids. The big and very cool change is that you also have a doggo. He's named Shadow, and he's great at bothering enemies who are that little bit trickier to reach, allowing you to then get in there with the old shuriken. A lot of people don't seem to care too much for the original Shadow Dancer either here in the arcade or on its various ports, but I have really strong memories of this game and will happily stick up to it, even if it did get superseded pretty frickin' sharpish. Once again, we are in weird territory. Dark Edge isn't a game too many people know, but it certainly sticks out. During a time when most people were perfectly content to rip off Street Fighter 2 and be done with it, and as we've seen, Sega were not wholly without sin there, Dark Edge goes in a new direction and presents a 3D fighter, or pseudo 3D, where you can go everywhere. You're in profile, you're third person, you're facing the screen, all sorts. I mean, it is very pseudo 3D, seeing as it's only early 1993 still, but it's a great example of just how far Sega had come with sprite scaling. Seeing just how dynamic it all is and how smooth everything moves is still quite impressive. And as good as the game is technically, it's also quite fun to play and filled with both close-in action and lots of projectile fun. I guess you could call this a precursor to the later and very awesome indeed Virtua Long games. We won't be talking about those for a couple of videos yet, but this game's a right good laugh. Of all the weird games in this video, we're now coming to the first of Sega's signature titles in this regard. And my word, it is a crying shame that we never got to see the puzzle and action games in the West. This one here, Tantar, is awesome. These games were sort of originally birthed by Bonanza Brothers, which we're going to see in a few entries' time. While the puzzle and action games are very different, they have much the same art style. These are, as the title might suggest, action-packed and quick-fire puzzles. You've got a puzzle that appears very simple, but you only have a short time to do them in, and you have to complete a handful of these to complete a stage. It's very similar to games like Point Blank or WarioWare, and well, look at how successful those were. I think that Tantar or Ichidantar or all the others not getting a Western release was a bit of a missed opportunity, to be honest. They could have been big hits. As it is, they did pretty fine in Japan, and it's easy to see why. They're highly addictive and the sort of fun that can be enjoyed by absolutely anybody. Great game. Columns is back again, and here's Columns 2. This is kind of the odd one in a lot of people's eyes, seeing as we had ports of Columns just about everywhere, we had Columns 3 on the Mega Drive, but Columns 2 is arcade only. Odd. Sort of. It's easy to see why, seeing as Columns 2 is basically just flash columns. You've got to take out the flashing blocks, much like Flashpoint. Indeed, most of the Columns home versions have flash columns in them, meaning that they could be classed as ports of Columns 1 and 2. I enjoy the flash variation of Columns. It's not all that much different from the original, and not exactly as wild as the worlds you get in Flashpoint, but it's still a cool take on a classic puzzle game. Just outside the top 10 we have another obscurity. You may well have never heard of Slipstream. This is a game from 1995 using the System 32 hardware, but for whatever reason this was made and published entirely by Capcom. Beyond the board that was used, Sega weren't involved in this one at all. Also, it appears that Slipstream only ever came out in Latin American countries, and it was also the last game released for the System 32 board. Now I can't think why this didn't get a fuller release, because this is a really bloody good F1 style racing game. I mean, it absolutely craps all over those utterly average Sega efforts at F1 racing we saw ages ago. It's got a nice camera angle, a really good feeling of speed, it's got a cool balance between arcade and simulation. It's awesome. Now, I have no idea why this never ended up getting any kind of full release in all honesty, but if I had to guess, I would say that racing games using 2D sprites like this one in 1995 would have been seen by most as very, very old hat. Now, I can certainly see why people wouldn't bother with this when you've got the likes of Sega Rally Championship and Daytona USA kicking about, not to mention Ridge Racer and so many others. But now, with all of that not exactly part of the equation anymore, it's easier to see Slipstream as the really good racer that it is. Perhaps the last great classic 2D racing game, in fact. Highly recommended. At last, we're in the top 10. And here's another game that doesn't necessarily spring to mind as being an arcade original. Crackdown is bloody great, but what with the tiny sprites and the small display, this feels way more like a console game. Obviously it doesn't help that I've never played the arcade until now, and I've played the Mega Drive game for years, and it helps even less that the game isn't emulated perfectly in MAME. You see that there's a lot of trouble with the top-down map. Still, it's a cool game in general. Very different indeed for a top-down shooter with a lot more strategy involved, the ability to take rudimentary cover, and a very wide range of enemies. It's certainly a standout title, and I'll happily play the game in just about any form. I mean, perhaps not early 90s weird Spectrum port, but any other will do.
Hurry up!
The Cosmic Ballet continues with the arcade Thunder Force game. Thunder Force AC isn't hugely different from its more famous console counterparts, seeing as it was made for the Mega Drive-alike system's C-board. Indeed, the sprites and stages are basically identical to Thunder Force 3 for the most part. You'll get clearer voice samples this time, mind. And you'll also get the addition of some stages and enemies from Thunder Force 2, which is cool because you don't have to play through the crappy top-down stages in order to experience them. Yay! It all makes for a bit of perfectly familiar and jolly good Thunder Force action, certainly one for fans of the series. It should be noted that this game specifically was the basis for the red-headed stepchild of the series, Thunder Spirits on the SNES. And it should also be noted that if you've got a Switch, you'll be able to play a Sega Ages version of this in, well, as of a couple of days ago I believe. Cool, huh? Doing a Switch announcement like that makes me feel just like Wood Hawker. In at number 8, we've got the third instalment in the Outone series. This game was kind of crap in its ports on the Mega Drive, but Outrunners is an awesome arcade. To me it feels like the proper sequel to the original Outrun. I've never been a huge fan of Turbo Outrun. To me it didn't feel like much of an Outrun game, especially as it got rid of the alternate routes, which to me is pretty bloody essential to the game. The multiple routes are back with a vengeance here, with loads of different stages to go through, along with some cool little extras like a radio that you can flick through during play. It's nice to have silly things like that. Much like Slipstream, Outrunners is one of the last hurrahs for the old school 2D racer. Not long after this, most everything you would see in the arcades would be 3D. Outrun would soon become 3D too, and it would be even better than this as a result. But Outrunners was a nice little last instalment of driving fun, at least for a while.
Come on, car number 1.
This is kind of a surprise actually. I've always been a bit when it comes to Bonanza Brothers, so I wasn't expecting to give it a particularly good ranking. And yet, here it is at number 7. Like a fair amount of these top titles, I'd never played the arcade version before. I'm totally used to its acceptably average Mega Drive conversion. But, damn, I didn't realise just how pretty this game is, and how bloody smooth and clean it moves as an arcade. This is what I'm talking about when I talk about the System 24's high resolution. It's gorgeous. What a cool little art style it's got. And it is a good laugh. You play as a pair of sublime master thieves, making your way through locations and robbing everything you can, evading or shooting guards along the way. It always amused me that Western localizations were keen to say that actually these guys are former thieves who are just testing out these security systems. They're not actually robbing these buildings blind or anything. You know, even though they escaped from the roof via helicopter, it's all totally kosher. Yeah, needless to say, these guys are not ex-thieves in the original Japanese version. They're working thieves. Sorry to burst your childhood bubble there. After playing the arcade version for this list, I have a brand new appreciation for Bonanza Brothers. It's a lot better than I'd previously given it credit for. Also, as mentioned previously, Bonanza Brothers would eventually beget the Puzzle and Action series. Here's the second of those that we're seeing here, Ichidanta. And it's more of the same. Excellent quick-fire puzzling that we saw in Tantar. Even though this game never left Japan, it's perfectly simple to play and the language barrier never comes into play. So, you know, you should absolutely play these, whether you do so on MAME or on the Mega Drive ports or on a compilation or wherever. Again, these games were just such a missed opportunity. I do reckon they'd have made some waves over here. You really ought to have a good stab at them.
Get him! You are under arrest.
Much like the origins of Tetris, Columns was the result of Sega plucking a little-known computer game out of general obscurity. The 1989 original by Jay Gertzen could be found on various platforms, primarily on the Atari ST, and in fact there are even clones of the game that just predate the release of Sega's arcade columns, such as Colorist on the Amiga from early 1990. And again, most people would think of this as a Mega Drive game, and not really an arcade game. That's hardly inaccurate, seeing as this is a System C game, and it's just about identical to the Mega Drive release that came a couple of months later. Whichever way you play it though, Columns is outstanding. To me it's pretty much as good as Tetris, and I've spent an incalculable amount of time playing both of them. There's a lot of satisfaction to be found in building up big wells and trying to get huge combinations, even if it has to be said that a lot of the time you might not actually know too much about it. It's a game made for Bob Ross, one where you have these happy little accidents that clear an entire world just when you think you're about to fill it. It's highly addictive, and the ancient Greek-style presentation, complete with relentlessly catchy music, is iconic. There are many cool variations on Columns, and we've even seen a whole bunch of them in this list, but as good as those may be, they still can't quite top the original recipe. Leaving aside the bloody awful computer game, Michael Jackson's utterly batshit Moonwalker ended up getting a pretty damn fine treatment by Sega. We do of course have the thoroughly good side-scroller for the Mega Drive, a game that you might expect would have had an arcade version. It's got all the hallmarks of good arcade play after all. However, the Moonwalker arcade game is totally different, and in fact it's even better. Here we've got an isometric viewpoint, plenty more stages, and various things that the games share. You've still got to rescue the kidnapped kiddies, you still attack with a magic touch, and you can make every enemy on screen dance, dance, dance to their death. And of course, you have one of the coolest power-ups in game history, the ability to grab a shooting star and turn into Super Mecha Jackson, straight from the movie, firing frickin' lasers and missiles and all sorts, turning enemies into liquid effluent. I mean, what can you say other than, ha ha, I like it? You just can't. This plainly rules, and it happens a lot more frequently in this arcade game than it does in the Mega Drive game, where Mecha Jackson is actually kind of rare. Moonwalker is generally a pretty great artifact from Jackomania, and while DJ Sloop or indeed Smooth MJ is probably disappointed that it isn't number 1, it still more than earns a place in the top 5. Into the top 3, and we've got another sweet beat 'em up. One that didn't seem to be massively appreciated at the time, but I've always dug it and it seems more and more people are feeling it. Alien Storm Wox. It's quite similar to Golden Axe, of course. It uses the same engine and the sprites are even kinda similar in parts, but there's a few upgrades here and there. One of the cool things about Alien Storm is just how much the gameplay switches up. There's the regular brawling sections, the running sections, and the brilliant little rail shooter sections where you trash just about everything in sight while laying these alien busters down. It's hard to be bored by the game at any point. And it's just got such a fun aesthetic. Very 1940s B-movie, very tongue-in-cheek, filled with poor civilians that suddenly get eaten or crushed and turn into monsters, aliens spewing out from every conceivable item on the streets, a frickin' Commando Cody-esque robot, and even the ability to pulverise all the enemies on screen with a nuclear missile. Totally not overkill at all, that. And whether you choose to set the world afire for the sake of killing a few tricky aliens or not, you'll have a tremendous amount of fun with this one. An excellent arcade game indeed, and happily people are coming around to its brilliance. Now, picking the number one game for this list was very tricky. By far the toughest decision I've had to make in one of these lists to date. We have two absolute gems facing off, and they're kinda completely different from each other as well. It was hard. But in the end, Gain Ground is number two. That might be a surprise. I have long been a champion of Gain Ground after all. Bluntly put, I think it's a stunning and totally unique take on the top-down genre, filled with strategy and puzzling, an awesome concept of taking war through the ages, the most varied set of characters that you can play with. It's one of my favourite games of all time. The brilliance of Gain Ground comes with working out how to beat stages in the proper way, killing all of the enemies. You'll need to know the details of your characters right down to the hands they use for their two attacks. How do they curl? How good are they with dealing with quick mobs? Who can strafe? Who can attack enemies on raised platforms? There's so much to consider, and when you're riding high, it's amazing. When it all goes wrong, it's a desperate struggle, suddenly thinking on your feet, trying to salvage a situation that can become hopeless very quickly. It's amazing just how quick this game can turn on you. There is so much to say. And while this is all definitely true of the arcade game, complete with aesthetic, music, System 24 high resolution and all of that, it's even more true of the Mega Drive game. That's where Gain Ground truly shines. It's not much different from the arcade, and even has an entire extra stage. And that's pretty much why Gain Ground ends up with the runner-up spot. It's one of the best games, but much more so in the home. And with that, there's only one choice for the top spot. One of the games that most people will agree is one of the greatest arcade games to never get a home port anywhere. Public feeling for this game is still so strong to the point that despite never having that home port, a company like Arcade 1UP can confidently give it a re-release on one of their mini arcades. Golden Axe Revenge of Death Adder is an all-time classic beat-em-up, one of the greatest ever, one of the textbook examples of how to do a beat-em-up sequel. Revenge of Death Adder is special. It's certainly a big step up graphically from the System 16 original, but it's also pretty different. There's a wider range of characters to pick from. Certainly there's no equivalent in the original game to a character like Little Trix who's super fast and has the power to spawn health power-ups, or of a big giant like Goa. The original Golden Axe trio did cover the fast, strong, all-rounder bases, but it's way more pronounced in Revenge. It certainly makes multiplayer way more interesting. And you'll want as many people as possible playing this. Revenge of Death Adder is so much harder, packed chock full of enemies who ain't exactly going to mess about when it comes to surrounding you. You've got plenty of tools of your own now, of course. There's a wide range of Bizarrians, all the usual attacks, and some absolutely spectacular face-melting magic. It's still an awesome looking game. It uses a lot of the System 32 tricks that we saw in Arabian Fighter a long while ago, but Revenge of Death Adder is definitely the better all-around package. Everything's just so strong here, nothing's sacrificed, great animation, great sprites, the lot. On the whole, what a game. Revenge of Death Adder did for the Golden Axe series pretty much what Streets of Rage 2 did for that series. An absolute blast of a sequel, and as an arcade experience, I think it's the right choice for number one. And that brings an end to this particular arcade board list. When I look at Sega's Arcade's returns, we're going to go a little different. Not so much a countdown, but a chronological look at the development of Sega's best known arcades. It's time to look at the scalers. We'll also have the vector games too. In other words, it's the big one. Hopefully you're looking forward to that. But until then, bye for now. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope that you enjoyed it. Now, if you liked this video and you generally like what you see, why don't you press that like button? Why don't you hit that subscribe and click the bell and all that other vlogger shit? Do all of that. Follow me on Twitter. I'm posting all the time pretty much. And if you really like what I do, why don't you have a look at my Patreon? You can find other stuff there, exclusive stuff, wrestling documentaries and other cool things. And you could also join this cool list of people right here. Alexa Jones-Gonzalez, Andrew Dalton, Arcade-OY Webmaster, Asobi Kwan DX, Brian Henniger, Chris, Conrad Pritchard, D. Xalio Rimwan Sutter, Dagorath Dungeon Keeper, Daniel Lomez, Danny Wolfers, Dave Cook, David Rose, Dinty765338, Dustin Cooper, Gary Samaden, Geordie Alex, Glunfef, J.S. Manchild, James Brown, Jace Alexander, Jeff Ladd, Lucas Kaligowski, Matthias Granzov, Michael Halliday, Mike Clayton Travis, Martin Pataki, Nate Milbank, Neem Kian, Peter Margel, Renby Mon, Robert DeFelice, Rusty Kelly, Seth A. Robinson, Simon Gulliver, Stuart Christopher Brownlee, Tariq Amir, Tim Ward, Yerka Operator, and to all the rest of you awesome people, thank you so much, and goodbye.